Well, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and friends, welcome to the Austria Connect Southeast Asia 2023. I'll be hosting this morning's session. My name is Claire Ejedragand.
I'm David Dachman, the Austrian Trade Commissioner in Singapore.
And thank you so much. It's our pleasure to have you here at the very beautiful Fullerton Hotel here in Singapore. Now, September. It was a huge month for us in September. We had the Formula One. And following the hustle and bustle of that, October, of course, we have Southeast Asia's largest Austrian business conference. And of course, everybody has flown in from around the world. David, well, this has been something which has been, I suppose, coming up to a year for you.
Yeah, indeed. We've been working quite long, since a year, on this conference, and we're really astonished that for the first time ever with such a large business conference with over 250 participants. All of you, thank you so much for coming. And it's the largest such event in Asia. And to make it a bit Austrian, I've wondered on the table, the glittery stuff. That's something Austrian already, I guess you know. Swarovski. So that's to give you an Austrian start.
That's right, David. Now, and just like the F1, the topic that is on our mind, on everybody's lips, is going green. And with that, we would like to invite up the President of the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber, Arnold Schiefer, for a couple of words.
Minister of State, Your Excellencies, Trade Commissioners, all our friends of Austria, so many here today, representatives of different businesses on the ground here in Singapore and the greater Asian region, but of course also a very warm welcome to all the representatives that came along with us, undertaking this delegation journey to Singapore, talking a little bit about our future business perspectives here in the region. And I do have to say, perspectives are quite fantastic. After meeting with your minister yesterday and you this very morning, I have to say the strategies of the two countries are quite aligned. Yeah? From a strategic point of view, both countries being in the very heart of a very thriving economic region with interesting economic perspectives. Singapore being in the very center of the ASEAN region with more than 660 million peoples. The majority of them will live in the big megacities within the next 15 years. So, meaning there's a lot we can bring from Austria and the Central European region to that very region, especially in very interesting fields that are extremely important for the future. For example, to touch all the issues regarding the transition of the energy system, because we all have to reduce carbon emissions. Namely, Austrian technologies in that field provide a lot in the area of renewables, as I said, hydro, wind and solar. Not in each and every part of the ASEAN region, each of these renewable energies will be as easily implemented as probably in Austria or in Central Europe, but we have to work together to closely collaborate with the areas of R&D and innovation to bring to the ground the best solutions, for the best circumstances, as the two of us just discussed. To focus in cooperation, for example, in the area of hydrogen, enormous potential for the future. And of course, to use Singapore as a springboard for the whole region. Singapore is like Austria in the very heart of Central and Eastern Europe, perfectly located here in this very innovative region. Yeah. From here, you have easy access towards Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and even from here you can easily reach the Philippines. So This is not only what we like to talk with you together today, but we can also learn from our partners here in Singapore how to do the best business in the region. Of course, we're living in difficult times, but these also probably our forefathers and foremothers said, all times somehow are difficult, are challenging. But the question is what you do with the time that is given to you. How to focus on perfect solutions, to find solutions for the problems ahead, for the problems on the table. And there are two different approaches we currently observe if we are traveling around the world and trying to support our businesses. One is to, dream of the past, cling to the old solutions, somehow a very traditional, very conservative approach. It doesn't bring you forward. It's not our way. Our way is the second way. We are taking a very different route, a bold route, a visionary route. We want to focus on innovation, on R&D, on new solutions. And therefore, we foster on much more cooperation between the R&D sector and our businesses, small as well as large, and then to bring that solutions to whoever wants to scale them around the globe. Today, we want to focus together with extremely distinguished speakers on that option for that very region we are here, to the Asian region. And we come as bridge builders, building bridges between the past and the future, between traditional approaches and very future-oriented approaches, bridges between old markets and new markets, and bridges between old services and very new value-adding services. So with that, I would like to close, wish you an extremely interesting conference, and at the end, big hands from all of us to the organizing team. You see, pretty stage. A really cool stage, a really cool speaker lineup, and with that, Captain Kiss, Minister of State, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Up on stage now, Minister of State, Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth, Ministry of Trade and Industry, Lo Yen Ling.
Thank you so much. A very good morning to all of you. And like what President Dr. Sohmen-Pao have mentioned, we have had a very wonderful discussion earlier. And a very good morning. And before I share a few words, may I just poll the room? I know you're a representative from Austrian companies. Can I ask how many of you are based in Singapore? Just a sensing. All right. Okay, about half. How many of you flew in from the rest of Southeast Asia? Wow, okay. Now, how many of you flew in together with Dr. Haraf and his team from Austria? Okay, right. So it's also a time for the Austrian community to do networking today. Eh? And now I want to really say a big thank you for inviting us and for choosing Singapore as the place to host the inaugural edition of Austria Connect 2023. And that's why we are really prioritizing this. And like what President Dr. Haraf have mentioned, my Minister for Trade and Industry, Minister Gan Kim Yong, had a very good session with you. And this morning, we also had a very, very constructive and rich discussion on the many, many areas we can collaborate. So once again, thank you for your very inspiring and passionate opening address, President of the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber, Dr. Sohmen-Pao, and of course, a very good morning to Austrian Foreign Ministry Secretary, General Secretary for European and Economic Policy, Elisabeth Kornfeind, and of course, very good to see you again, Ambassador, Austrian Ambassador to Singapore, Peter Goscher-Bauer, and our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, and we are very, very delighted to join you for the inaugural Austria Connect Southeast Asia 2023. Now, I was very, very impressed watching the video. And I must tell you that, like what President Haraf mentioned, we have a lot of similar attributes. We were talking about how similar we are as a gateway in our respective region. And that is why we in Singapore continue to look at opportunities for us to learn from our friends from Austria. For example, next month, Ambassador Peter will know we're flying 30 of our top senior civil servant, public service leaders to Austria to attend a pretty lengthy, learning lessons over there as part of their leadership training program. And I just came back from Seoul. Why do I talk about Seoul? Because every year, Singapore will host the World City Summit, where the city leaders will converge in Singapore once every 2 years on then during the alternate year, it will be held at a place where, we award the World City Summit Lee Kuan Yew City Prize. And congratulations to Austria for winning the World City Summit Lee Kuan Yew City Prize. Last year, I had the pleasure of meeting Mayor Michael Lewitt. He's the mayor for Vienna. You saw the beautiful pictures, cultural capital. And happy to update all the friends here that a few hundred city leaders, mayors and governors will converge in Vienna in 2 years' time for the World City Summit. So I think let's keep the sharing of best practices going. And I think it's important we do that. I want to echo what President Hara have mentioned, because we really face a period of increasing uncertainty and transition. It's very unfortunate what is happening in the Middle East between Israel and the region. But I think it goes to show that this is the flux that we will continue to see. We continue to face a period of uncertainty and transition. Climate change, geopolitical conflicts, supply chain disruptions, and growing protectionism have all led to instabilities and disruptions in the global trading system. I think we all know that the world is also undergoing major structural shifts, and that is why it's important for governments to join hands with businesses, chambers, and we must continue to work together and stay nimble and adapt swiftly to these developments. And sometimes, I think we also have Singaporean friends here. There's a Chinese saying, 危机中总有契机. It means sometimes, in a crisis, there will be opportunities, right? If we keep our focus and stay straight and narrow, work with like-minded partners. So amidst these challenges, today's conference is very apt and very, very timely reminder, like what the President have told us, to look outwards and not to look inwards, to look outwards and to seek new growth opportunities. So we're very delighted that the businesses from Austria, who flew in from Austria, flew in from Southeast Asia, and those based here, and our friends from the region are here to explore the broader potential in Southeast Asia. We can certainly work together to chart a pathway forward together as we exchange insights and ideas. And allow me over a few minutes, on behalf of the Singapore government, on behalf of the Singapore Ministry of Trade Industry, to quickly suggest 3 ways for Singapore and Austria to strengthen and build our existing partnerships while seeking new sources of growth and new sources of dynamism. Firstly, I want to echo what President have mentioned. Let us continue to advance our country's global and regional trade connectivity. I think in today's age where many countries are turning inwards, all the more countries like Austria and Singapore, we must continue to look outwards and advance our country's global and regional trade connectivity, because economic interdependence is really critical for our countries and our economy and our people, and critical to our countries because we are all centers of trade and commerce for our region. And Singapore is certainly committed to strengthening existing partnerships and forging new ones. Now, I think many of you will know, in Singapore, one way we overcome our small domestic market is by establishing an extensive network of free trade agreement, FTAs, worldwide. And even more recently, just last year in 2022, we signed an FTA with Pacific Alliance, comprising Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. Now, this built on existing agreements between Singapore and the Pacific Alliance countries and enhance our physical connectivities with a new chapter on international maritime transport services. Now, another quick example, and we were having a chat earlier during our breakfast discussion, is the example of EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, which really forms a vital economic bridge between Austria and Singapore. And I think many of the business leaders here in this room will know that since the EU-Singapore Free Trade Agreement's entry into force 4 years ago in 2019, our bilateral trade in goods have grown by 40%. Even during COVID, 40% in just 4 years, right? And close to 1.8 billion in 2022. It's quite remarkable given that most of that 4 years, actually, we are all going through COVID-19 pandemic. So I think all this means that there's a lot of room for upward trajectory. Now, this really demonstrates the value of FTA in generating tangible benefits and new commercial opportunities for businesses on both sides. So it's not a zero-sum game, it's really win-win. And we should continue to use these agreements to strengthen these growing linkages and deepen economic cooperation with new and existing partners in different regions. Earlier on, we were just talking about how we can collaborate to set up control tower activities using Singapore as a springboard for Southeast Asia. And even as you are feeling your way within Southeast Asia or even the broader Asia, President brought up a very good point that, and he discussed with Minister Gan Kim Yong yesterday, actually, Singapore, we have been forging a lot of collaboration like industrial park. In Vietnam alone, we have more than 10 Vietnam-Singapore industrial park. And what this means is, for some of the Austrian companies that are keen to invest in Vietnam, but you don't quite know how to feel a way around, actually one way, right, to really plug and play is by considering citing your first presence in the Vietnam-Singapore Industrial Park. So that's one way we can further our collaboration. Secondly, we want to encourage businesses to diversify into the new markets, especially into Asia and Southeast Asia, using these government-to-government agreements. Both our countries, President and myself, we have highlighted that both our countries are vital hubs in our respective regions. And we in Singapore certainly welcome Austrian companies to look towards Southeast Asia. I think the reason why many of you are based in Southeast Asia, you know that Southeast Asia is a bright spark in the global economy with a steady growth of more than 5% every year. Now, with a sizable young population and a rising middle class, Southeast Asia certainly looks set for a strong growth trajectory in the coming years. So Austrian companies can certainly use Singapore's strategic location to springboard into this region by leveraging our extensive network of partners and free trade agreements. You know, in Singapore, although we are a small country, we are just a city-state, we have no natural hinterland. I asked how many of you are based here because by now you know, to get from the east to the west in Singapore, you only need less than 45 minutes. But also, what this means is, in a densely populated Singapore, you don't just meet Singapore companies, you meet, this is really an enterprise ecosystem where you can meet thousands of multinational corporations, a few hundred thousands of small, medium-sized enterprises, not just from Singapore, but from other parts of the world as well. And the second thing I want to quickly talk about is with the strong economic activity and connectivity here and a stable legal framework, certainly Singapore offers a conducive environment for Austrian companies to seize opportunity in the region, either by collaborating with companies here or by leveraging on the infrastructure that we have forged with the countries like the Vietnam-Singapore Industrial Park, like our collaboration with our Indonesian partners via the Bintan, Batam, Raw Islands, or via our close collaboration with Malaysia, especially with Johor. So we want to encourage Austrian business community to partner with Singapore businesses to venture into Southeast Asia and explore new possibilities through co-innovation programs and business exchanges. Because together, Singapore and Austrian companies can expand our capabilities and our regional networks. Now, it doesn't need to be only focused on market access. Earlier on, we talked about many of the high-tech areas. We talked about energy. We were a little bit late coming into the conference room because we want to steal another 5-10 minutes, talking about how we plan to transit to a low-carbon future. And I shared with President that in Singapore, we have 4 sources of energy. One is LNG, solar, regional power grid, and low-carbon solutions, hydrogen, CCUS. And we want to learn from the best practices from Austrian community where we can do better. And I think in the space of energy, in the space of CCUS, I think there's opportunity for Austrian companies to collaborate with Singapore companies. And for all you know, in time to come, we might see a unicorn coming out of this collaboration, yeah, that's founded by an Austrian and also Singaporean. And for example, in Singapore, our National Research Foundations, I think some of you will be familiar, announced that Singapore government will be investing $25 billion from the year 2021 to year 2025 in many growth areas, AI, ESS, energy storage system, data science, biomedical science, etc. And in addition to that, I shared with President and his team that even before COVID hit us in year 2016, we have started invested $4.5 billion into 23 industry transformation map. Ambassador Peter will be very familiar. Now, what are these 23 industries? They include advanced manufacturing, built environment, professional services. If you Google it on my ministry's website, you'll find it, so I don't want to bore you. But why these 23 industries? Because these 23 industries comprise 80% of Singapore's GDP. And there are a few planks to that. We look at internationalization, helping our companies to grow their global footprint, innovation, and we look at sustainability, etc. I'm sharing all this because all these are really platforms that Singapore companies and Austrian companies can consider collaboration, especially in the area of co-innovation and co-development. So thirdly, very quickly, I want to pivot and talk about how collectively we can seize growth opportunities in the green economy and the digital economy. Singapore is investing heavily in growing our green economy. I think many of you will know last year we signed our first GEA, Green Economy Agreement, with Australia to catalyze growth and jobs in green growth sectors. We are also seeking to reduce the barriers to trade and investment in green goods and services to make it easier for businesses to pursue emission reduction. So we are keen to work with Austrian companies, with like-minded partners to grow our green economy, be it to build new capabilities to achieve our climate and environmental goals, or to pioneer the development of new rules and standards. And I think this is a space where there's a lot of room for us to explore and set reference standards that potentially has a chance to be a global standard. We can also explore many possibilities from carbon services and low carbon solutions that I talk about, or even green finance. So I'm very glad to look at today's theme, because a key focus of today's conference is sustainability, and it's very apt. And I really hope that today's discussion will help us all spark new ideas and fresh ideas for companies in both Austria and Singapore to work together and shape a sustainable future together. And apart from sustainability, data and digital connectivity are really the lifeblood of a digital economy. And on this front, there's been strong momentum in our efforts to strengthen the digital connectivity between Europe and Singapore. In fact, earlier this year, we signed the EU-Singapore Digital Partnership, and we jointly established a set of digital trade principles as a key deliverable. So I'm very, very pleased to share that both sides have since built on these two initiatives to launch negotiations on the legally binding EU-Singapore Digital Trade Agreement. That will really be quite game-changing. Yeah? And so I look forward to the growth of digital trade and strengthen digital connectivity between our regions in time to come. Now, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I want to thank you for choosing Singapore as the location to host the inaugural edition of Austria Connect. And on behalf of the Singapore government, we want to thank the Austrian Federal Economic Chamber and the Austrian Embassy on successfully launching the inaugural edition of this conference. And again, warm welcome. We hope that other than attending today's conference, you make time to explore the rest of Singapore. And we wish all the participants a very, very fruitful discussion. And we look forward to expanding the close cooperation and collaboration with Austria to seize the new opportunities for sustainable economic growth for us. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you to Minister Loh. Okay, right now we'd love to invite up Her Excellency Elisabeth Kornfeind. She is the General Secretary for European and Economic Policy, Austrian Foreign Ministry, please.
Minister, President of the Austrian Economic Chamber, dear business and media representatives, ladies and gentlemen. What remains to be said? I think a lot has been said already. Let me start with conveying the greetings from Minister Schallenberg, who has this project very close to his heart, and he wishes you all of success for today's conference. For me, it is an honor to be here today and stand in front of, I think, more than 270 representatives and 160 of the finest companies in Austria, Singapore, and Southeast Asia. Bringing diplomacy and business closer together is a key priority for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and for Minister Schallenberg, and of course for myself. And this forum already is a true success story of diplomacy and economy working hand in hand. And Minister, you mentioned we have challenging times of rising inflation, energy costs, interrupted supply chains, and crumbling export markets. And that's why our goal is simple, to put Austria more firmly on the map in Southeast Asia and vice versa. And for that, Singapore is a perfect hub. I'm impressed by the dynamism of the country, the creativity of its people, and the rapid trend-setting development of its economy, and you just gave us wonderful examples of that. Ladies and gentlemen, crises we face together cannot be solved by one country on their own, so we need to work together. Consequently, Austria wants to forge stronger partnerships with Southeast Asia, politically, economically, and culturally. To make it clear, we want more. More investments, more trade, more tourism, and more exchange in the areas of culture and science. After all, our experts are the backbone of our prosperity. We always say that roughly 6 out of 10 euro generated in Austria can be attributed to foreign trade. Almost every second job is directly or indirectly dependent on exports. I refer to the productive program we already had in this country, and you can see we had a full agenda that has brought us all to Singapore, so clearly we mean business. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm convinced that together we can build a strong, mutually beneficial partnership. Austrian companies deliver high-quality goods and services, they're extremely loyal, and once they enter a market, they are here to stay. And I do not get tired of pointing out that with Austria you can be sure that our trade and investments come with no strings attached. That might distinguish us from some of the other partners in the regions. Let me thank again the Austrian Economic Chamber for organizing this conference, and I wish all the participants an engaging forum and thought-provoking discussions. Let us use this momentum and get down to business. Thank you.
Thank you to Our Excellency Elisabeth Kornfeind. Okay, with that, let's kick off our first keynote session of the day. This is Finding Solutions for Tomorrow. And that's how the shipping industry can help to drive a circular economy. And with that, I'd like to invite up Andreas Sohmen-Pao, the chairman of BW Group.
Dr. Mara, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As an industry, shipping is not as sexy as cars and aviation, but we carry 90% of world trade and have a big impact on the world economy. We also have a big impact on sustainability, and it was good to see Apple last week affirming that it's 95% more efficient to send iPhones by ship than by air. As a so-called hard-to-abate industry, what can shipping tell us about sustainability? Our group, I don't know if there's a slide showing, but we are on both sides of the equation, as we're involved in traditional forms of energy, you can see here on the left, but we are also investing heavily in energy transition. And actually, most of our investments are happening here on the right in solar, wind, biofuels, batteries, and so on. But we can switch this off because it's not going to be about BW. I'm going to talk about what we can do ourselves in the industry, but also what we can do in coalition with others, and where we need some government input. And because of the breadth of this audience, I hope that you can see somewhere you can plug in on that spectrum. How do you decarbonize a hard-to-abate sector like shipping? Well, the starting point is always self-improvement, And here we have a very strong incentive, of course, to reduce fuel consumption. That means special hull shapes, better paints, modifications to propellers, even air bubbles as lubrication to help the ships through the water, and fixed sails for certain ships and routes. It means we're using increasingly sophisticated technology to help optimize navigation routing and to optimize engine performance, and we're using AI or machine learning to optimize our operations. These efficiency improvements typically yield about 10 to 15% in aggregate of improvements. Like the auto sector, engines have actually seen a large improvement over time. So 15 years ago, and sorry to share statistics, but I think this paints a picture, our ships carrying 130,000 tons of LNG. As you all know, Europe last year sucked in a lot of the world's LNG because of the Russia crisis. Our ships carrying 130,000 cubic meters, which is enough to power the city of Boston for a month. They burned 180 tons of fuel per day. Our modern ships carry 180,000 tons, so they're much larger, and they burn only 100 tons. So we've gone from 180 to 100. That's a massive efficiency improvement. The problem is that once these engine improvements start to plateau, and we're seeing that now, it's hard to achieve the higher levels of emissions reductions that we're looking for. And at the moment, what's happening is the International Maritime Organization, which is a UN body that regulates shipping, is setting the targets higher in line with Paris and other pressures. So just this year, we increased the targets. So shipping must reduce by 20 to 30% emissions in 2030 compared to 2008. By 2040, it will have to be 70 to 80%, and by 2050, 100%. One of my messages today is that targets are incredibly important, but I think these targets are going to be hard to achieve, especially the 2030 target. And I'm going to share with you why and how hard it is to do this. The only way you can really meet these levels is with zero carbon fuels. There are 3 options on the table currently. The first is biofuels, where there simply isn't enough, and we have to compete with other sectors like airlines. The second solution is methanol. Methanol can be formulated with renewable energy, and you synthesize with biogenic CO2 to make CH3OH, methanol, clean methanol. To produce enough hydrogen for the world fleet, we would need 7,000 terawatt hours of renewable electricity. That is twice the current global production from solar and wind. Because methanol has this carbon atom in it, it releases CO2 when it's burned, so it only works if you can make it with CO2 that's already been captured, in other words, from biogenic sources. We need 900 million tons of biomass. The third option is ammonia, where there are no engines in existence yet, although they're being worked on, and where we still need to build the ships and the fueling infrastructure and the safety standards. Green ammonia also needs the same hydrogen from renewable power, so it's going to take these terawatt hours of energy. Here we have the option of blue ammonia, which is natural gas with carbon capture, but the point is that we're unlikely to see too many ships sailing on ammonia before 2030. The world fleet today is 60,000 ships, and we currently have 300 ships on order with clean fuels. So to sum this up, let me put the hard reality in this way. The shipping industry currently consumes 2.5% of the world's fuel. To meet the 2030 emissions target, we will need up to 40% of all available green fuel in the world. To get to zero, we will need all the renewable energy in the world. And the fuel will cost 3 to 6 times what it costs today. That's probably the easiest problem to solve, by the way, because shipping is so efficient that actually the cost to the consumer becomes very small on the end unit. So my summary here is we're doing a lot of work, including on new fuels. We're setting higher targets, but we just need to ensure that our targets don't become detached from reality. So what can we do collaboratively? What can we do about this? Minister of State Loh spoke of collaboration and Dr. Mara spoke of bridges. 2 years ago, we set up the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization here in Singapore, GCMD as we call it. In the span of 2 years, we raised $200 million from 17 core partners, including BW, BHP, BP, Chevron, NYK, Cetrium, and others, another 10 coalition and knowledge partners, and over 80 project partners. The Maritime and Port Authority of Singapore provides funding support for initiatives in Singapore. We assembled a team of engineers and scientists, because if one is not science-based, then everyone gets lost in opinions and emotions and corporate self-interest. GCMD, in the space of 2 years, has really put itself on the map for decarbonization because it's a credible place for people to work on solutions together. We're not a think tank, we are a do tank. In other words, we are about pilots with real infrastructure and trials, not just research reports. Piloting solutions, of course, has a cost, and so GCMD allows companies to spread the cost and risk of doing pilots. What are we doing specifically? We're testing biofuels to see which ones work best, because there are many grades. We're testing synthetic DNA tracers, where we put tracers in the molecules and trace them through the supply chain, because biofuels get blended on the way through. If you pay a premium for a biofuel, you want to know that it actually has this low carbon source, and you have to trace it through the supply chain. We're preparing trials with ammonia to see if we can do safe refueling. And we're testing carbon capture on board ships to see whether this is a feasible pathway. It's not easy, because running a chemical plant on lots of ships around the world to capture CO2 is complicated. And then you need to liquefy it, store it, offload it somewhere for permanent storage. But it's not going to stop us from trying. And then we share the learning also with smaller companies that can't afford to take part directly. So my third part was, what can governments do to help us? Because firstly, there's a lot that we can and should do ourselves. And secondly, there's a lot that we need to do collaboratively in centers and with private sector coalitions. What can governments do? Well, the first thing is to support public-private collaboration, because tackling something as big as climate change needs this interface. The private sector needs the regulatory support. We can't do ammonia trials in GCMD without regulators and ports allowing us to do it. And the public sector needs corporate agility and creativity. So that's why we set up this center for collaboration, but we have to recognize that when you put together two parties with different agendas and speed and risk appetite, it takes quite a lot of work. The second area where governments really need to intervene, where we need help, is infrastructure. For energy transition, this means the electrical grid above all. The West is simply underinvested in the electricity grid. And now I'm not talking about shipping, but shipping in future needs clean fuels, which needs electricity. So this all connects. If we're talking about decarbonization, it all connects. I'll give you some examples of this. If you look at high voltage DC lines, which is the most efficient way of transporting electricity over long distances because you have less line losses. Germany has 220 kilometers. The UK has 300 kilometers. Denmark has 2,000 kilometers. That's maybe not so critical for shorter distances within countries in Europe, but even the US has only 2,400 kilometers of HVDC. By comparison, China has 48,000 kilometers and is building another 66,000 kilometers by 2025. India has 19,000 kilometers and is building 165,000 kilometers by 2026. That's 40 to 80 orders of magnitude greater than the US. Without an upgraded grid, whether we're talking about local or long-distance lines, it's going to be very hard to move the green electrons. And our group, as you saw earlier, has a solar company in the US, and I can tell you from first-hand experience that interconnection queues are getting longer. In New York State, it's 1,900% of capacity, and it's now taking up to 4 years from application to commissioning. And Europe is not much better. 596 gigawatts of wind and solar projects are now stuck in grid connection queues, just in UK, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany. Austria is amazing, by the way, because it's 80% renewable, so some of these issues are easier for Austria, but Europe has a challenge. A third area for governments to play a role is price signals. For instance, putting a price on things with a social cost like CO2. In shipping, many of us are keen to see a carbon levy on the fuel we consume. It's amazing. We're actually an industry that wants to be regulated and have a CO2 price put on us. And we can say this with confidence because we have this very powerful secret strength, which is called the International Maritime Organization. When shipping enacts regulation, including pricing and regulatory changes, it applies to everyone in the whole world. No carbon border adjustment mechanisms, no need to worry about squeezing the balloon and pushing the problem elsewhere. We have a level playing field. We think it would be especially effective if this is a flat tax or levy, not a fluctuated trading system like the ETS, because the more visibility we have on price, the more we can model it into our investments with confidence that it'll be worthwhile. When you've seen the ETS in Europe going from, over the last 10 years, it's been from as low as 0 up to 90 euros, 100 euros, and back down to 30, and then back up to 80. How do you know what investments to make when you have no idea what the returns are going to be? Apart from taxes, incentives can of course help too. The IRA in the US, as we know, 300 billion of government incentives that has unleashed trillions in private investment, and Europe is now trying to follow also. China, as an example, has made its strategic priorities very clear to the private sector. You all know the statistics about coal. People say China is the biggest coal consumer, but in the past decade, China added 270 gigawatts of wind. The US added 90, and the UK, as the European leader, added 18. Now, in China, you also see these statistics like 80% of the world's solar panels, 90% of the world's permanent magnets for wind turbines, 75% of the world's battery cell capacity, 87% of rare earths processing, and so on. I don't know how much the government has provided in direct subsidies there, but actually there's quite a lot of competition between private sector and provinces, which has created these champions like CATL in batteries and SunGrow in inverters, solar panels, electric vehicles, and so on. And what's interesting to consider as a sort of final note here is whether government intervention at a certain point interferes with the free workings of the market. When a European government gives 10 billion euros in direct incentives to a single chip maker, is that going to distort normal functionings of the market? What we're seeing in shipping is protectionist measures rising dramatically. So some estimates were about 9,000 protectionist measures a decade ago and 35,000 today. And we're also seeing this, and this is a really important point, that in spite of some of our markets going crazy, there is no supply response. So to give you an example, in oil tankers, the return on equity in oil tankers last year was 50%, 50. what is the dividend yield you get on an average share in the market? 3%, 2%, 4%? The dividend yield on tanker stocks last year was 30%. The price-earnings ratio of tanker companies today is around 3 times. You know, Ørsted, the wind company, is 18 times. Equinor, the oil company, is 9 times. Tanker companies are 3 times. So what happens? The markets have gone to the sky and nobody is ordering tankers because the banks have been told don't lend to oil. And the equity markets have been told don't invest in oil. And everybody says don't invest, but what ends up happening is you have a shortage of critical infrastructure. So that's where I just worry about the free markets actually being undermined by over-regulation. My last point, coming back to my earlier comment about zero carbon fuels, I'm going to give you a choice. If you produce a green electron, you can keep 100% of it by using it immediately, maybe 95 if you have some losses in the electrical line. You can keep 85% of it if you put it in a battery. So if you can't use it, you can stick it in a battery and you can keep 85% of your green electron. Or you can produce hydrogen and clean fuels, in which case you can keep less than 30% of it. Which would you choose? Why would anyone choose the 30% option? This is what's happening when we want to produce clean methanol or clean ammonia. You take thousands of terawatt hours of renewable electricity, you throw away 30 to 50% to make hydrogen with an electrolyzer, then you lose more to synthesize ammonia and methanol, then you ship it around, and then you convert it back to energy, by which time you've got very little of your original electron. And this is what happens when we ask each industry to fight its own turf and find its own solutions, rather than taking a step back and looking at the entire energy system. And I know that's very hard to do, and I'm not arguing against industries doing their own work, but the more we drill down to industry solutions, the more we lose the picture for the total energy system. Okay, in closing, I am actually very optimistic that we will find solutions over time. I think the stretch to 2030 is going to be incredibly hard. But, you know, the long-term future, human ingenuity, and we saw this wonderful video at the beginning, human ingenuity combined with machine learning, we are going to solve this problem. I have every confidence. I just think that we need to keep our feet on the ground. Remember Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman, who said, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. Shipping, like other industries, will decarbonize, but it will take hard work, it will take time, and we should be realistic about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Well, our second keynote for this morning, driving change, accelerating transition finance for a greener future. And coming up to say a couple of words is Mr. Ravi Chidambaram, co-founder of TC Capital, founder of RIMM Sustainability, adjunct professor at Yale NUS College.
Yeah, thanks. Well, honored to be here today speaking in front of such distinguished guests. So thank you very much for having me. I'm going to step back and provide a more macro overview of the climate transition in ASEAN and also talk about the role of sustainable finance in that. As a business guy and an academic, I'm most comfortable with PowerPoint, so I hope you can bear with me while I go through about 15 slides. First of all, it's fair to say that ASEAN is deeply affected by the climate crisis. According to the German NGO, German Watch, in fact, 4 out of the 10 most affected countries are here in ASEAN. Whether you measure that by deaths, property damage, or other metrics, you will see that the climate crisis is very acute and very real in this part of the world. It's fair to say that many ASEAN members are now recognizing that and doing things about it. So they've made various sorts of pledges. While very few have made explicit net zero pledges, with the exception of Singapore, many countries have made other pledges to at least have a certain percentage of renewable energy on the grid, or indeed set up transition finance schemes within their countries or multilaterally to try to address the climate crisis. Indeed, there's a new ASEAN Sustainable Finance Taxonomy that some of you may be aware of, but it's actually a very critical breakthrough and a very critical piece of legislation to address the climate transition issue in ASEAN. It's been set up a little bit based on the EU taxonomy. It does differ in some very critical respects, so it's similar to SFDR in the EU, but in ASEAN they use the green, amber, and red coding system. What does that mean? Well, a green finance project under this classification would basically mean it does no significant harm. It is a transition measure in terms of emissions, and it also protects social aspects such as human rights, labor treatment, and so on. So it's very unambiguous in terms of which projects fall under the green. The red is the most controversial, and here there's significant difference from the EU in that ASEAN is recognizing the need for coal as an important part of the energy mix. The reality is many ASEAN countries do 30 to 70% of their energy in coal. So therefore, somewhat controversially, but perhaps practically in line with what Andreas had talked about earlier, acknowledging market realities, coal can be phased out after 2030. So coal is still allowed, but will be phased out by 2030. Amber, of course, is something in the middle where projects may not meet all of the criteria for transition finance. However, they will mitigate over time and therefore permitted. Sorry, this is a bit of a technical chart, but it just sort of illustrates very clearly which projects fall under the green, amber, and red codes. And it's a very important framework because what it does is, for the first time, it lays out for banks and regulators, what they need to do. Here's the phase-out sunset model for coal, and you can see that that's for 2030. So, as I said, for the first time, we will start to see very clear rules that banks, fund managers, and regulators can apply in determining what things fall under the green, amber, and red activities, and basically how this will be addressed. This will apply to all banks and fund managers operating in the region, and you can see it sets very, very clear goals. So for ASEAN to make its climate transition, there's a long way to go. You can see here that if one wants to be in line with the Paris Protocol by 2050, which is quite delayed actually, you can still see that whether it's using renewables, whether it's using energy efficiency or other metrics, ASEAN has a long way to go. Currently, only about 20% of ASEAN is powered by renewable energy. That would have to go up to 65%. The investment, which is currently about $15 billion a year, would have to go up to $75 billion a year. Energy efficiency, which is 1.1% a year, would have to double. And new energy types such as hydrogen and new technologies such as carbon capture would have to be introduced. So it's a very daunting challenge, especially when coal remains a major source of energy in the region. This is a very interesting chart because you could see that probably over half of the coal-fired plants in ASEAN are less than 14 years old. So a lot of this is new capacity, which has come online. It's very critical to meet the energy demands in growing economies in places like Vietnam, Indonesia, and so on. So it's a very daunting challenge. The reality is the energy is needed, and therefore fleet has been built, but a lot of that fleet is still very young. So how does that tie into the energy transition? Well, there are many proposals out there from the EU, from other multilateral bodies, and from the private sector in Asia itself to try to phase out these coal-fired plants early. However, as you could see, it would come at a tremendous cost. Nevertheless, there's some very interesting proposals on the table to phase out some coal-fired plants in Indonesia, for example, but it's a $30 to $70 billion cost. This, if we believe in a more rapid climate transition, will become a very key component of financing for transition finance, the early retirement of coal. Solar is probably the most achievable renewable technology in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular. You could see here that in the energy transition, solar is well over 50% of the renewable mix, and that is probably a very key point. However, I think, as was always pointed out by Andreas as well, many ASEAN countries are not ready for a renewable transition. We talked about grid infrastructure being a roadblock in the US and Europe. It's the same issue in ASEAN to the extent that many grids are not ready to take on a lot of renewable load. Regulatory policies with respect to carbon taxes and such are still at a very early stage and underdeveloped. And the reality is that even with the need for transition, even with the phasing out of coal-fired plants and so on, a lot of the infrastructure and policy making is not geared up currently for a rapid change. On the carbon tax front, only Singapore in ASEAN currently has a carbon tax. No other country does. It's not surprising given the political opposition to carbon tax in fossil fuel-driven countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, even Vietnam. And therefore, a lot of things are being discussed in terms of cap-and-trade schemes and other types of carbon policies, but the reality is it doesn't really work today. This is a very interesting chart because it shows how carbon taxes could be very effective if implemented. This is the example of Vietnam, and you can see here that at a $14 carbon tax, which is a pretty low carbon tax, actually there would be incentive for companies to start switching into renewables. If you start taking that up to $70, $80, even investment in carbon capture technologies and so on begin to make sense. So one can see how carbon tax could be an important part of changing corporate behavior. In terms of what we need to do in ASEAN, we have a long way to go in terms of the amount of money that's needed. For Austrian companies, companies from Europe who have advanced technology, there's a lot of opportunity in this region if married to transition finance. Those opportunities exist in climate adaptation, grid infrastructure, renewable technology, energy efficiency technologies, and so on. It's viewed as a $1 trillion a year opportunity, and indeed some $3 trillion is needed if we are to have more aggressive 1.5 degree targets by 2030 in this region, which I think is unrealistic, but even if we stretch it out to 2040, 2050, that's a significant opportunity. So this is really where, for all of you, it's a big opportunity to bring advanced technology. However, you will see that a lot of that technology is not doable and implementable without the need for more transition finance. Right now, transition finance is mainly debt funded in the region. It's mainly funded by local banks, and it's woefully inadequate. There's not enough equity, there's not enough grant money and other sources of money coming into the market to fuel the transition. Here are some leading banks in Southeast Asia and their lending policies. So even within debt, you will see that a very small percentage of their lending portfolio today goes into renewable projects. In fact, far more go into conventional fossil fuel projects. As I said, that's the reality of where we are. So this won't do, even in terms of debt. Blended finance is going to be really, really important to boost more equity investment in sustainable finance. What is blended finance? Blended finance is effectively providing multiple forms of subsidies around public-private partnership investment. It could involve government subsidies like tax breaks and other subsidies to encourage investment in sustainable projects. It could involve multilateral aid, grants, assistance to reduce the cost of capital into projects. And all of this will be needed for equity investors to get the kind of commercial returns they need to actually embark on these projects. The other elephant in the room when it comes to transition finance in this region is the general perception amongst ASEAN members that the problem was not invented here. The problem was primarily invented in rich countries, and they should bear the burden of funding the climate transition. This, of course, is a recurring theme in all of the COPs, as any of you who attended the COPs may know, and it will be a recurring theme for a long time. So many countries in the region, their view is, we're not going to do much about it until you pay me to do something about it, right? So this is a big issue, and this is the whole subject of the unequal costs of climate change. ASEAN countries, as I showed you on the first slide, are bearing a disproportionate burden in terms of the impact of climate change, but they don't feel they're responsible for it. So how do we address that? Well, again, all of you in the room, the EU, Austria, other rich countries, have a very important role to play, and they are beginning to play it. So some of you may be familiar with the JETP schemes under COP27, which were set up to provide transition finance for early retirement of coal plants and other transition finance projects in this region and globally. So Indonesia has already availed of a $22 billion facility from JETP to retire some coal plants early and also to investment in renewable grids and renewable energy in general. Vietnam just signed a deal with the EU to avail of an $11 billion facility to do the exact same thing. So this is now beginning to happen and will be needed. So this load sharing will have to be done. But of course, in return, one would expect the EU and other rich countries to have their members have better access to technology, better access to providing their technology into these projects and so on. So there has to be a balance. Japan is starting to do something similar. They announced a recent $1 trillion initiative to do the same. But again, the catch on that is they want Japanese companies to provide a lot of the climate adaptation and other technologies. But that's understandable. So let me close on that note. I hope I was able to give you a bit of a snapshot and an overview of where ASEAN is currently on its climate transition and the massive amounts of capital that are needed and some of the things ASEAN is trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ravi Chidambaram. Well, coming up also a very important coffee break. And of course, some wonderful delicacies for you just outside of this room. We will restart the session at 10:45 sharp. So if I could please get you guys to come back into the room, as we do have quite a packed schedule for this second half of the morning. Thank you and see you a little bit later.